for billions of years, the only way that you could figure out whether you were right or wrong was to go out and do something, and if you died, you were wrong. But now, you can think about doing something, and if the consequence of running the simulation in your head is that you die, then you don't do it. How might you conceptualize the fundamental elements of a personality? Well, this is what it looks like to me. The first thing is, you're a moving creature. So here's a funny story. There's this little animal whose name I forget. And in its juvenile, it's an ocean animal, and in its juvenile state, it swims around. Okay, so in its juvenile state, it has to coordinate its movements and interact with the changing environment. So it has a brain. But then when it turns into an adult, it attaches itself to a rock and turns into something that's sort of like a piece of coral. It promptly digests its own brain. So the issue is, unless you don't really need a brain if you're not going to go anywhere, right? So a brain is a going places thing. And we have a very big brain, and so it's like we're always zooming around doing things. We've got these hands that enable us to manipulate things and transform things. And so the brain is for doing things. It's not just for perceiving. Roughly speaking, the back half of your brain is for perception, the cortical part, mostly visual perception, but some auditory and touch, a lot of visual. And the front part is for output, motor action. And as you proceed, imagine the front part starts halfway here. As you proceed from the midline forward, the action becomes more and more abstract until when you're dealing with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you're thinking abstractly. Now, people think that when they're thinking abstractly, they're thinking about representations of the world, because we think about objects. But that isn't what we're doing. What we're doing is rehearsing potential schemas of action. So we have this abstract space, which you might think about as a duplicate world. You have an idea, you test the idea like you would test it if you were acting it out in the world, and if the consequence of the imaginary testing is you encounter grief, then you don't implement the idea in the world. Now, that doesn't always work because there's trade-offs between short-term pleasure and long-term punishment that makes it complicated. But what seems to have happened is that as we've evolved, we're very sneaky creatures. For billions of years, the only way that you could figure out whether you were right or wrong was to go out and do something, and if you died, you were wrong. But now, you can think about doing something, and if the consequence of running the simulation in your head is that you die, then you don't do it. And so what you're basically doing is spinning off multiple potential yous in multiple potential universes and running them as simulations, And now we really do that now because we've externalized it onto the computer, right? Which is what we're doing with really, really complex video games. So it's so smart. It's an amazing evolutionary advance. Now, it doesn't work that well because sometimes you run the simulation and you think, this is a stupid idea, and then you promptly have 8 beers so that you can go do it. But all things considered, that's still what this abstract space is for. I should tell you something about this too, because you're going to hear from neuropsychologists that a lot of what the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does, the prefrontal cortex in general, is impulse control. And that's wrong. That is not what it does. And part of the reason I know this is because the correlation between prefrontal cortical cognitive ability, which is very tightly associated with IQ, by the way, like the correlation's like 0.9, so you could even argue it's the same thing, fluid IQ in particular. The correlation between dorsolateral prefrontal cognitive capacity and conscientiousness, which is like long-term goal-directed, future-oriented, planned activity, is 0. Okay, 0 is a very bad correlation when you're trying, the old idea, correlation doesn't imply causality. Well, wrong. It does strongly imply causality. It doesn't demonstrate it because with every causal relationship, there's a correlation. So 100% of causally related items have a correlation, right? 100% correlation. So, well, not necessarily, but it implies correlation. It does not prove it. Right. But 0, that's bad. That means that those things aren't related. Now, if you think about it, you can understand why. They have to be unrelated. Because if you embodied your abstractions then you wouldn't be able to experiment with them. You just act them out, and then bang, you'd be dead. So you have to separate the cognitive activity from the embodiment completely, so that you can choose which of your potential selves to incarnate, so to speak.